Good afternoon from Columbus, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. I am Stephen John Quaye, and I'm currently an associate professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us for the fourth conversation in the ASHE Presidential Webinar series convened by current ASHE President D.L. Stewart. This webinar is being captioned live, and those captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button in your menu bar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the ASHE website in the next week. Throughout the webinar, you can pose questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. They may answer the questions throughout as they come in or at the end. The purpose of the ASHE Presidential Webinar series is to engage leaders on critical issues about equity related to space and place in higher education. Let me distinguish between place and space. According to Eric Jacobson, places are imbued with memories and experiences, whereas spaces are blank states that have yet to be transformed into places and may in fact never morph into places. Places help us develop our identities, but spaces give us the space, so to speak, to reflect on what is possible with our identities. We need both places and spaces. The borders of gender equity usually stop at women getting into senior leadership roles. This approach at best ignores and at worst invisibilizes trans people and all women, cisgender and trans, who are in facilities, food service, and other areas of campus lower in status and hierarchy. In this fourth and final webinar, I invited 4 scholars to engage in a truly expansive conversation about gender equity in higher education. TJ Julian is an independent scholar, consultant, trainer, and educator, and the founder of Transformational Change, which seeks to transform people, institutions, and organizations by centering those at the margins. His work centers the experiences and knowledge of trans and queer people of color. He values drawing connections between seemingly disparate ideas, people, and goals, with a particular attention to shifting organizational culture in a collaborative manner. Previously, he was an assistant professor of higher education leadership at Oakland University. Layla McLeod is assistant professor of higher education at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Prior to becoming a faculty member, she served as an assistant dean of students, director of student success and retention, and director of multicultural student engagement. Her work centers on race and equity in higher education, with particular attention to the academic and social experiences of Black college students. Keon McGuire is an assistant professor of higher and post-secondary education in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and a faculty affiliate with the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. His research explores the experiences of minoritized students across post-secondary educational settings with a particular attention to race, gender, and religion. He also examines these issues systemically by looking at how racism, sexism, and heteronormativity undermine the experiences of minoritized college students and how these students resist such oppression. And finally, Z. Nicolazzo is associate professor of trans studies and education in the Center for the Study of Higher Education and a member of the Trans Studies Initiative at the University of Arizona. Z's research centers on tracing discourses of gender across post-secondary educational contexts with a particular emphasis on transgender students. Her recent work focuses on how institutions of higher education invest in and further modes of trans killability, especially in relation to trans girls, women, and femmes. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you especially to the panelists for your time and labor today. I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation. Before I pose the first question to the panelists, I want each panelist to briefly say hello, recognize where you're joining from, and share anything you want us to know about you and your work. Let's start with you, TJ.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you all from part of Lenapehoking, the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape people, today called Philadelphia. For over 10,000 years, the Lenni Lenape have been the caretakers of these lands and of the river of human beings, known as the Delaware River. As the original people of this land, I acknowledge, honor, and express gratitude to the Lenni Lenape and their continuing relationship with the land.
Thanks so much, TJ. Layla.
Happy Thursday, everyone. Again, my name is Layla McLeod. I'm joining you from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is the land of the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Boda Wademi people. In addition to expressing gratitude to the Indigenous communities on whose territory I live and work, I also must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development through history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants, including me. I'm indebted to the labor, to the land, the sacrifice of our Indigenous and African ancestors, and I hope to continue to honor their legacies in my everyday actions. In addition to that, I want to acknowledge who I am as a mother of a son who I'm constantly in conversation with about issues of gender and masculinity and femininity. So today I represent my son as well.
Thanks for that, Layla. And thanks for bringing your son into this space. I appreciate it. Keon, why don't you go next?
Sure. Good morning to some, and good afternoon to others. I'm speaking from Arizona State University, where our 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on the ancestral and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Akmalathan and Peepash peoples, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. I want to thank the ASU Library site for that quote. I would also like to call the name of Mary Green, a Black woman born into slavery, who was brought to Arizona with her 2 children to labor as a cook with the Columbus Gray family from Arkansas in 1868. And lastly, I would like to call the names and honor the memories of my eldest ancestors, who I had the privilege of knowing intimately as a child. My great-great-grandmother, Josephine Canty, who was born August 14, 1897, and transitioned February 1st, 2000. And my great-grandmother, Rosa B. Stokes, who was born September 11, 1917, and transitioned April 28, 2006.
Thank you, Keon. Z.
Hi, all. I am joining today from the lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui peoples. Today, I'm thinking of the people, lands, and more than human species that continue to be present and continue to create life in and through the violence of settler coloniality. I also want to bring into this space the trans women of color who have always made life possible for trans people in this country. May we honor the dead and fight like hell for the living always and in all ways.
Thank you all so much for those introductions and reminding us of both the historical and contemporary connections to Native Indigenous peoples, and also the labor of Black and Brown folks also into the space. So I really appreciate those introductions. So let's dig in. So just as a reminder for folks, the focus of this session is thinking expansively about gender equity in higher education. So in order to help the audience grasp gender in higher education generally, I want each of you to talk about 1 or 2 lessons you have learned from your work so far. Layla, let's begin with you.
So when I think about this, the first thing, honestly, that came to my mind is, I don't know anything. I'm learning for sure, obviously through my work and my conversations and being in community with people that I love, but there's so much that I need to sit with in terms of understanding my own gender and how I, as a cis Black woman, perpetuate harm through my work. I think a lot about the ways, particularly that cis heterosexual Black women may unintentionally create boundaries or borders about what it means to be a Black woman. I think about, and I've been in conversation with folks about the phrase "listen to Black women." And for me, it's always, which Black women are you talking about? Which context? What do Black women need to do to deem them as someone that we listen to? And who gets to determine that? So I'm trying to think more expansively about what, not only what Black womanhood means, but what Black femininity means, which are two separate things. And not, femininity doesn't belong to women. So thinking about that. And lastly, that studying Black women doesn't mean you're studying gender, right? Which is mind-blowing in many ways for me initially when I started to think about that. But it means that the people that you're in conversation with, if you're studying, saying you're studying Black women, the people you're in conversation with are, identify that way, but are you asking them how they understand gender and or femininity and how that influences their understanding of your questions, right? So there's so many layers to that I think, I need to trouble with my own work, and then I want to encourage other folks to do as well.
I appreciate that response, Layla. One of the pieces I think of this particular session is nuance and complexity. And I just appreciate how you brought both of those into your question. So I'm really struck by your comment about listening to Black women. And one of the things that you said was, which Black women are you talking about and in what context, right? So that comment alone, I think, pushes us to think more expansively, think more deeply, think more in complicated ways about the notion of gender. So just in that little phrase, I think you complicated it for listeners, and I really appreciate that. TJ, what are your thoughts?
There's definitely 1,000,001 lessons that I could spout off, but for today, I'll just focus on 3. One is how very little people and institutions care about trans people, and how much trans people have to make up for it in caring for each other and for ourselves. The second one is how deep intergenerational trauma is in how we carry and hold our genders, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I would say that third, it's how incredibly beautiful and brilliant trans people are. And that's a lesson I keep learning in lots of different ways and iterations on a constant basis.
Sorry, I'll still writing notes down based on what you said. So to TJ's point, one of the things that I loved in TJ's response was this notion of acknowledging intergenerational trauma. Yes, and also the beautiful, right? Like, so to me, both of those can exist together. And I think is what makes, Z talks a lot about the resilience of transgender people, right? And so it's acknowledging not just the trauma, but also I think the beauty in who they are. So I appreciate you saying that piece. Z, let's bring you into this conversation.
Yes. 3 cheers to beauty and dreaming and imagination, and all the world making that trans folks are doing, right? I think what I've learned is that a lot of folks are unimaginative when it comes to gender. I think that most folks tether the word gender with the word women, and further tether women with a specific type of woman, as Layla was commenting about. And that specific type of woman is really the figure of the white non-trans woman. And this sort of unimagination is, I would argue, a form of willful ignorance. And it's really the root, at its root, is a form of anti-trans womanness and anti-Blackness that leads to harm. So for example, when we unimagine beingness for Black trans women, we continue to surveil and regulate who gets entrance into the category woman, which then forms as a mode of institutional capture in educational contexts. So I've learned also that this leads to higher education's investments in furthering logics of killability for trans women, both epistemologically and as a result ontologically. So this all has, right, this kind of unimagination and this unthinking of womanness in particular ways, all has what kind of using Lee Patel's words here, crushingly real consequences for trans women in and beyond education, especially Black trans women in the United States.
Z, let me ask a follow-up question. You know, you use the word right now, trans killability. So for those who might be unfamiliar with that term, like help unpack that for audience. What do you mean by that?
Sure. My quick academic answer is I have a piece coming out about that soon. But the short nugget is, you know, basically when we unthink trans women, as Layla was talking about, what we do is we create a lack of space, and we create the conditions in higher education where trans women are only desired insofar as they can be used, commodified, and consumed, and then made disposable. So that's the notion of trans killability. I'm building off of really powerful and wonderful work that
I think your connection is maybe unstable, Z. I think you're back now.
Okay.
So the last thing I heard
Sorry.
was, I'm building on really powerful work, and then you just left us hanging.
Oh, okay. Sorry. By Dr. Ava Hayward, one of my colleagues at the University of Arizona. So I'd encourage people to check out her.
Great. Thanks for unpacking that. I appreciate it. So we've heard so far just more nuance, right? Layla talked about listening to Black women, but which Black women? TJ talked about this notion of like the three pieces of around like there's intergenerational trauma, but then also how incredibly beautiful and brilliant trans people are. And then Z brought in this notion of, you know, when we think of women, we're thinking of a specific type of woman, right? That usually means the white non-trans woman. So again, we're adding complexity and nuance here, which I really appreciate. I want to bring you into this question too, Keon. So what are your thoughts on the first question?
Yeah, thanks, Quaye. First of all, I'm humbled and excited to be on the panel. I have an immense amount of respect for everyone that's here. So I appreciate this being in conversation today. So I would say that I've learned in part not to be lured towards an emotional or rhetorical positioning of innocence. So whether that's through discourse or narrative of exceptionalism or these kind of self-representational practices of setting myself apart from communities with whom I share meaningful relationships. And this is not the same as trying to reach for some type of martyrdom, but simply to always ask, in what ways am I implicated by, complicit in, or committed to reproductions of gender inequity? So it's kind of a modest attempt for me to have some kind of integrity and take responsibility for who I am becoming. Second, what I'm learning is to be more intentionally expansive in how I approach masculinities and practice and theorizing. And so reaching back again to Layla's comment about kind of sitting with my own understanding of gender and trying to push that more expansively. How do I not allow my work to be overdetermined by my own subject position, but also those that I'm in research and practice communities with? And these are arguments that, you know, folks on the panel have made. I think about the work I know Layla and TJ will talk about later, TJ's work around transmasculine pathways, Z's work around methodological violence. And so for me, is me more consistently asking myself, how do I resist kind of the socializations within normative systems of knowledge organization that often materialize as commitments that render all non-cisgendered persons, and I want to call back to Z's words, that ontologically and epistemologically participate in logic self-killability.
Thank you for that, Keon, and for the acknowledging, I think, the complicity, the ways in which we perpetuate the very things we say we're against, right? So I appreciate you owning that. So let's move to a related but different question here. You all have been getting at these pieces already, but I want to ask the question more directly. So one of the things that I've learned in particular from you, Z, is just how to think more expansively about gender from you and your work. So I'm wondering if you can help the audience understand the gaps and limits of how scholars and educators treat gender in higher education. More specifically, what do many of us overlook when it comes to gender?
Yeah, thanks for that comment and question. And I will say, Stephen, I think a lot of what I've learned about gender has been enhanced and informed by our ongoing relationship, especially as a former member of my committee. So I appreciate all the thinking that we've been able to do together about this. You know, I think some of the things that we maybe overlook or could do a better job thinking about are, we still are working through and trying to explore and understand binaries. And so particularly I'm thinking about, we need to have more complex understandings of the trans cis binary. So here I want to call on Finn Enke's work, particularly a chapter that Finn wrote called The Education of Little Cis that I would encourage people to read. And also the non-binary binary that TJ and I have written a blog post about. Both of these actually serve to, these binaries, they serve to further heteropatriarchy and therefore invest in the logics of anti-Blackness and trans misogyny. We're still, as a field, thinking of gender as a single access issue with little attention paid to structures of racialization, nationality, disability, and class. And so I'm particularly wanting more people to think about how gender is a colonial and anti-Black imposition. I think we're also mostly thinking from an insular higher education studies only perspective. So I would encourage people to engage with Black studies, Indigenous studies, border studies, and disability studies more widely. And I want to give a shout out to my good friend, Dr. Rachel Wagner, for giving me the phrasing here. But I think broadly, we're still thinking about gender as written on the body. And so I think we need more attention focused on the methodological, ethical, aesthetic, analytical, and affective possibilities of trans, which would also then necessarily encourage people to recognize how gender is a form of social control for everyone's lives. And thus it's necessary to interrogate across various research topics beyond just, quote, gender research and beyond just trans people.
I appreciate that Z. Let me ask a follow-up to your point. So help me, am I making this link correctly? So one of the last things that you said was gender as a form of social control for everyone's lives. And then you also mentioned this notion of gender being written on the body. Are those two concepts linked? And if so, like, help us see how they're connected, or what you mean by gender written on the body, and how it fosters this notion of gender being a form of social control.
Yeah. So, you know, when I think about gender being written on the body, or the assumption that gender is written on the body, I think that we always want to think about gender as an embodied phenomenon. It certainly is and can be, and also it's more than that, right? So instead of thinking from an either or perspective, perhaps another one of those binaries we need to start to corrode, I would encourage people to think about a both and perspective, right? That gender is both an embodied phenomenon and a socio-political phenomenon, and has affective realities, and is a way to think methodologically and analytically about various different topics and phenomena. And I think in that sense, yes, when we think about gender as only embodied, that is a part and an extension of, right, discourses of gender that is a form of social control, right? And then locates the problem of gender on trans people, which is to say then that trans people are a problem, right? Which we probably need to unwind quite a bit and quite fast.
Thanks for that. I think that's super helpful. I appreciate it. So let me bring both TJ and Layla into this conversation and direct a question to you. You know, Keon alluded to some of your work earlier in one of his responses. And so at Ohio State University, I teach a student development theory course. We have 2 student development theory courses. And last semester, graduate students in this course read one of your articles from a special issue of the Journal of College Student Development focused on Black trans masculine students' constructions of Black masculinity. I and the students really appreciated this article. Like they loved it. They appreciated the nuance, the complexity, the participants' voices. I could go on and on, but that's not what we're here for. So let me just get to the point of the question. So in order for the audience to also maybe potentially share in my appreciation of this article, can you offer people some highlights from the article related to gender equity in higher education? And Layla, maybe you can start and then bring TJ in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for assigning in your class and thinking through it with your students. I really appreciate that. And also thanks to TJ for being in community with me as we read through these stories and thought about this project. So as we mentioned before, I come from a student affairs practitioner background, and that really influences what I'm thinking about or how I'm processing some of the work that I do. And one of the things that sits with me about this particular piece is, the ways that institutions try to, create a sense of belonging or, promote retention, particularly around Black students, is to create these gender-specific groups, right? So these men of color or male of color initiatives for Black men, Black women, Latino males, the list kind of goes on and on. So the institution is actively engaged in creating these boundaries for students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students. In doing so, we're making assumptions about how Black students engage with their gender. So for example, you'll see, these photos of Black men in suits, this idea that Black masculinity is inherently tied with how you dress, and this idea, again, of being written on the body. But that's just one aspect of gender performance. I'm thinking about Dr. Steve Mobley and Dr. Jennifer Johnson's piece, No Pumps Allowed. What does that mean when we assume that folks, again, need to perform it in a certain way? Who are we leaving out? So this piece that TJ and I wrote, from a practical standpoint, or for those of us that are actively involved in creating community for undergraduate students on campus, what assumptions are we making about how Black students, who they are, how they interact with their masculinity and femininity, and how these programs reinforce or constrain our understandings of Black masculinity and Black femininity? And how do we understand Black students as racialized and gendered beings, right? That those things need to be teased out if we're going to create programs like this. And what does that mean for students? For trans, essentially for trans students, right? How are we making space? How are we centering them in these initiatives? If you're going to do it, you need to center Black trans students. That's I think a big takeaway. And additionally, I think going back to my earlier point about studying particularly Black women, we also, we used Black trans feminist thought in that. So I think there's definitely room for us to reconsider, expand, and we're going to say expand a lot today, expand the theoretical frameworks that we use to look at gender and particularly Black students, right? So I'm thinking about Dr. Krista Porter at Kent State and her Black women identity development model. I'm thinking about Dr. Tiffany Steele at Oakland University, who's pushing us so beautifully to think about, if we're using theories that position Black women as adults, but we're talking about college women, there are theories around Black girlhood, right? There's room for us to consider what that means. And that one particularly stuck with me because I was 17 years old when I went away to college, right? So we think about the adultification of Black women. So there's lots of great pieces out there that are encouraging us to think, again, expansively about gender and sexuality, femininity, masculinity as it relates to Black students.
I really appreciate that response, Layla. And part of the reason why I really appreciate it is because you give, I think, the audience very tangible ways to think about this, right? So to me, this is not a theoretical issue that we're talking about. Like, this actually has real implications on the lives of the people that we're talking about, transgender people, women of color, folks with minoritized identities in those ways. And so to me, I really appreciate just us hearing just how it has those real consequences for what we do and how we view students with these identities. TJ, what are your thoughts, since you're a co-author in this article? Anything to add about to Layla's comments?
Sure. And I just want to reiterate, I loved writing this with Layla. It was just such a labor of love and friendship. So just wanted to add that. I think similar to what Layla has been saying today about studies that include Black women not necessarily being about Black womanhood. Studies with trans populations also suffer from the same issue, right? They're not necessarily about transness or gender. And in fact, most of the research in higher education doesn't really ask about trans students' genders. They ask about their collegiate experiences, right? And even in examining those experiences, the inquiry is often very one-dimensional, right? As if experiences of transes are shared across this incredibly diverse population. And we're not exactly being expansive anything if we're lumping transes into a homogeneous existence, right? Always completely separate from men and women. And I'm purposely saying men and women, not cis men and women, because transness is treated as its own gender often. So cisness is implied and doesn't have to be named. And then focusing on sameness amongst trans students in these studies. Paisley Curra has been doing some work in terms of incarcerated populations, namely that incarcerated trans populations have much less in common with non-incarcerated trans people than they do with incarcerated cis people. Right? I'm super oversimplifying the work here, but just wanted to make a point about how experiences don't cross trans populations necessarily. And building on what Z talked about in terms of gender-based binaries that are invested in anti-Blackness and transmisogyny and colonialism, institutional constructions and even individual embodiments of transness are contending with what Layla talked about in terms of institutional reinforcements of anti-Black Black masculinities, along with white-centered trans narratives and Black femininities. And all three of which are set up to be different and or oppositional to each other at all times. So how does a Black transmasculine person wade through all of those and through this mess to configure something that's authentically their own, that honors their full humanity, and not have them also pick up along the way anti-Blackness, transmisogyny, misogynoir, and all their intersections. Black transmasculine students are doing a lot of work here, and contrary to what's also in the mainstream around cis Black men, these students talk a lot about their fathers as role models in their constructions of non-toxic masculinity. So I think that was a very key piece for me. And Layla mentioned the piece about our frameworks, and we also wanted to emphasize what many have already said, that Black feminism in and itself is already gender expansive, right? Because they talk about the intertwined nature of anti-Blackness and patriarchy, and very clearly name, we find any type of biological determinism a particularly dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic, right? And so at the nexus of all of that, what I hope that folks are getting from the article, which builds on Reggie Blockett's work in thinking with queer of color critique, is that using Black-centered frames to analyze gender and trans-centered frames to analyze race resist comparing Black students' gender enactments with those of white students, right? And kind of what Z was talking about, using frames that are not necessarily thought of as the ones to use for race or gender gives us a lot more complicated notions around students' identity.
There's my pen is like running out of ink here. There's so much I was trying to capture in those last comments, and so I don't want to lose that point that you just said, TJ. So please correct me if I didn't hear this correctly. But I think what you said was using Black-centered frames to think about gender. Is that correct? Yeah, can you repeat that last point? Because I think it's really powerful and I want to make sure that folks take it home with them.
Absolutely. So it was sort of both. So using Black-centered frames to when studying Black students, right, is critical, but then also using race frames to study gender and gender frames to study race, right, to just kind of do this interchange among them.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I mean, I'm just, again, the word of the day is complexity, right? And so, but to me, it's exciting because that's what the students who we're working with deserve. Like, they are living complex lives. And so we can't make sense of their experiences through these single axes, as he was referring to. Like, we have to be more nuanced and complex in what we do, because we owe it to students for that. Like, that's how they're living. So it's a disservice if we're not thinking more expansively and complexly about their lives. So in the vein of, complexity, nuance, complicating issues, we're gonna go even deeper here. So Keon, I want to bring you into the conversation here. So one of the lenses that we haven't talked about yet that I know is a cornerstone of much of your work is religion, and its relation to gender and race. And so can you discuss this intersection of religion, gender, and race? So how does this help, how does this manifest as we think about gender more expansively?
Sure, thank you. And I was just joking, I think we should quote TJ's framing there and then give it appropriate citation so people can use it. Joking, but seriously about that. So for me, I want to start back by reaching back to be in conversation with Layla's example of the Black men's initiative, which I think was extremely powerful and appropriate, that emerges out of her and TJ's work, and specifically naming the violent gender norming that exists when Black men are always already assumed to be cisgender. And when these Black subjects, I think, are assumed or represented through kind of imperial onto epistemology of a US-centric Blackness, they're also often considered to be Christian or somewhat Christian to some degree. And so riffing a little bit off of TJ's turn of phrase, which I thought was, again, very powerful, of transcentered frames to analyze race and Black-centered frames to analyze gender, I think we might benefit from bringing a religious-based analysis to those phenomena that we imagine to be void of religion, particularly when we're thinking about communities where the kind of theological and cultural ideas share a lot of similarities and overlap, and oftentimes emerge out of this same types of community spaces. Within my own work, and I've attempted to build off the work of folks like Sherry Watts, D.L. Stewart, and Elon Dancy, I've been interested in the role religion plays in the making of Black gendered subjects and the marking of places along a rigid secular sacred binary. So at times, religion can serve as a very restrictive and narrowing socializing mechanism that marks appropriate ways of being and being with others in the world. So this might include, for example, reproducing gender binaries, disciplining femininities, and promoting benevolent, soft heteropatriarchs, all of which has implications for aesthetic or sartorial representation, spaces and places, as well as the affective economies that govern beyond conscious intentionality. Ultimately, I'm trying to follow what Monica Miller argues is that we need to ask we need not ask what's religious about a thing, but rather what these classifications accomplish among particular groups of people across time and space. And so this allows us to also tell a story, not only the ways in which power is implicated in the making of subjects and spaces, but also to talk about how people in communities have always continue to bring into reality so many beautiful ways of being that is considered incommensurate by some. So in this regard, I think of the work of folks like Camila Rashad in Philadelphia around through the Muslim Wellness Foundation. I think about Vanessa Taylor's work through the Drinking Gourd, and even there's a recent short film or semi-recent short film called Noor and Layla by the director Fawzia Mirza, that is about reclaiming ritual through queer Muslim love told at 5 moments in their relationships that's marked by the Asan or call to prayer.
Thanks for that, Keon. And for, again, adding, I think, more complexity to the conversation here, and really pushing back against these binaries, the simplicity that is the heart of, I think, much of our work. So thank you for that. I just want to remind the audience, we have a little over 15 minutes left. If you do have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. We're going to get to your questions in about 8 minutes or so. So I just wanted to remind the audience about that. So Z, I want to bring you into the conversation here, and just any reflections or thoughts that you have about what your co-panelists have been sharing so far.
Yeah, I guess my first thought is I don't know why I'm on the panel, because there's a lot of brilliance happening with my friends and colleagues. I'm glad to have a front row seat. I mean, I do think that the one thing that I might offer is that, you know, if we think back to this notion of gender equity, what I'm hearing from all of us is that gender equity doesn't mean that we all study trans people. That is not the takeaway from this. But what gender equity may mean is that we study through trans analytics, or at least recognize the power and capacity and capaciousness of trans to open up gender in necessary ways. And that doing this and thinking analytically about this expansiveness that Layla has been hitting on and using that word, that doing this also means that we're studying gender in a way that's pro-Black, pro-Indigenous, sexually expansive, transnational, pun intended, and always, always, always pro-trans woman. And so I think, you know, that big takeaway, we're not saying everyone needs to study trans people, and also we do think that there are particular analytics, or that's an argument that I'm hearing, right, is that we need to reorient the way we think, and perhaps do some unthinking around how gender operates.
You got some contributions too, Z. So like don't undersell them, but I appreciate that. So I'm probably going to pose one more question here, and then I'll see if the audience has any questions. But I want to get this one in here, and it's to you, Layla. So when I introduced you, I discussed your previous roles as a student affairs administrator. I'm wondering specifically about the labor of cisgender and transgender women of color in these roles. First, can you discuss this extra labor? And next, what do you suggest that for those who are tuning into this webinar do specifically to address this labor?
Yeah, so I'm over here like rocking back and forth and saying amen and all this other stuff as I'm listening to my family talk. Because this is such a great conversation. So I'm just really thankful for all of y'all. But when I think about the work of women on college campuses and the uncompensated labor, I'm always drawn back to the concept of other mothering, right? Which is often thought of as a gendered term, but it exists within the Black community, this idea of communal care, or I got you, or if I got it, you got it, right? In a professional sense, if we're thinking about how we do this work. So, you know, regardless if we're related by blood, we're connected, you're someone I'm going to take care of. And in my experience as a practitioner, and now even as a faculty member, this is, uh-oh, it feels like I'm frozen. Have I frozen?
You're good, Layla.
Uh-oh, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so I'm not sure if it froze or where I left off at. Uh-oh, freeze again.
You're good on my end, Layla.
Oh,
You're also
okay.
good on my end, yeah.
Sorry, I can't see, but I'll just keep going. This idea of other mothering existing on college campuses and that burden being placed particularly on Black women on campus. So this idea that always checking in with students, doing labor that our colleagues may not do. But sometimes that's also exhausting. Lots of folks have written about this, but I don't know that there's enough attention paid to the exhaustion that comes with that, especially if you're the only woman of color or Black woman in your department or your program. This is not always a reciprocal relationship. It's not something that can be documented for tenure or promotion or for any type of additional compensation. So I think there's also an assumption, and this may be where the gendered piece comes in. There's a gender assumption that Black women want to do this, right? And that we're able to do this. And I think that's a limit with this concept.
Thank you, Layla. All right, so I'm gonna check to see, pause now here and see if there's any questions. You know, I'm really comfortable with silence, but this is also being recorded, so I'm not gonna pause as long as I normally would in a class, for example. But I do wanna at least pause a bit to see if folks who are tuning in today have any questions for the panelists. So there is a question from Gabriel. So Gabriel is wondering, thinking about terminology, how do we differentiate between men, males, and masculinities as it relates to talking about and identifying students? Any of you have a response to that question?
I can kick it off, and I'm sure other folks will have brilliant things to add on. I think for me, it really depends on what we're asking, right? And what we're thinking about and who we're thinking with. So for me, I don't know that anything that we do in higher education really involves males, right? Males is about student sex. And so we don't really do much when it comes to how students were assigned at birth. Like that, for the most part, is irrelevant to the work that we do. Our work is with their gender and with their gender expression, right? So for us, we're really looking at men and masculinities, not males at all whatsoever. And there, we have to start breaking it down, kind of re-quoting Layla, which men, right? Which men are we talking about? We need to be really specific. If it is cis men, let's be specific about it. If it's not supposed to be just them, how are we making sure that our approach makes room for lots of manhoods, right? And then masculinity is something that is embodied by any gender, right? That's not necessarily owned by any one body of people. So I think that one in particular needs a lot of work within our scholarship to untangle from males and men.
Yeah, I'll just add one teeny quick thing. So TJ and I were a part of a group that included Siduri Haslerig and Chase Catalano in writing what we called an ASHE affirmation of trans livelihood in and beyond post-secondary education. And we actually have a specific point in that statement about this language around male and female. As TJ said, we probably shouldn't be using that language by and large. There are some particular reasons why we could be using it, and they're specifically connected to legacies of chattel slavery and the ungendering process that Hortense Spillers talks about. However, by and large, because we're not doing chromosomal testing with students, we probably should be thinking about gender and the phenomenon of gender. So I'll drop, oh, Jason beat me to the link. So yeah, thanks Jason for sharing that.
Thank you both for that response to Gabriel's question. I appreciate it. The Q&A is now blowing up. So let me go to the question that I saw first in here, which was from Sai. So Sai is wondering, something I've noticed in conversations around gender on campuses is the running away or refusal by non-trans people to critically engage with gender outside of an embodied framework. How can we move past this refusal?
Is it okay if I jump in? So I think maybe I'll situate this in my own verse. And I think like when I think back to my own kind of socialization and training in Africana studies, particularly through my engagement with Black feminist literature, it oftentimes pointed me towards gendered experiences and less. And I realized I wasn't as I didn't benefit from an engagement with gender studies in particular. If I'm trying to make that distinction without, there's a way that the facticity of gender was already assumed from the type of knowledge that I was engaging with, right? And so the question became, how are these systems of power imposing on these already assumed to be knowable gendered bodies? And it wasn't till, really in my most recent work, I've sat down and paused a little bit to think, what would it mean if I walked away from that assumption that I always already know who's showing up in front of me, and what does that mean with the assumptions of what Z talked about earlier, of gender being written on the body. And I think your colleague, Rachel, I'm forgetting the last name that you gave a shout out to, and I apologize for that.
Wagner.
Wagner, thank you. And so for me, it was helpful to make that distinction, right? And to say, we absolutely can think about the way, say, gendered racism shows up in the world. But I think we need to also have almost a re-education to some degree, right? Around what it means not to start with gender from the body. And I think, I'll say this and then in here, and from the scholarship we produce, I think, and G, I think this isn't someone in conversation with what you said, but push back if it's a misreading. But there's also both in the, I think our if we engage more with kind of multimodal scholarship that refuses a certain type of linearity, a certain type of coherence, essentially imposing of empiricism, right? And the strict rules of social scientific empiricism on our work, we can also represent the more dynamic ways that we can think about gender. And we do engage with gender in the everyday that we don't produce in our work. And our field, by and large, still is, committed to a very social science kind of empiricism that, says this is data and this is not, right? Or this is rigorous and this is not.
Thanks for that response, Kian. I want to get to a question by Alex because I think this question connects a little bit to the previous conversation we've been having. So Alex is wondering, thinking of higher education institutions as a particular container of gender foreclosures and possibilities, what do you see as the unique challenges to and possibilities of gender equity in higher education institutions?
So I can start, and I think one of the distinct challenges, or perhaps unique challenges for thinking about gender equity through institutions of higher education is the supposed liberalness of higher education. I was just in a session yesterday with Geneset Gutierrez, who showed the now kind of famous video of her interrupting President Obama about 6-7 years ago now, and trying to get attention for the ongoing devastation that trans undocumented people face. And what was shocking to me rewatching that video wasn't what she was saying, it was the reaction to what she was saying. Under a liberal administration, and with seemingly liberal people in the room celebrating pride, for some, not all, right, is kind of the underlying comment. And I think institutions of higher education face the same types of things. We're always heralded as a liberal bastion, and yet the ways that surveillance and the ways that containment happen become all the more pernicious because we're already seen as good, kind subjects, right? Many of us know that this is actually not the case, but I think under the guise of liberalism, it becomes all the more nefarious and all the more difficult, especially when people want to individualize structural issues. Well, I'm a good person, I care about people, I'm wearing a button saying, I'll go with you to a restroom, right? Or I have a trans friend or whatever, that is a unique challenge for us. And because I'm a cynic and my friends call me their favorite little rain cloud, I'll just leave it at posing a challenge and see if other people have some possibilities for us.
Can I jump on the cynic train though? I feel it rained today. I'm gonna I mean, my first thought is like, this stuff keeps people employed. We have whole departments and offices that have been created to kind of manage this stuff. So now you're talking about you want people out of jobs now, right? What am I going to do with this, this money that the institution has given for this initiative around gender that reinforces things that we know to be problematic, but people have built their livelihoods around this, right? So to disrupt that, where do people go then? Right. And that's just me being a complete jerk. But I think it's important to think about how the institution has is really invested in this, and invested meaning monetarily, hiring people, making snazzy t-shirts. We love a t-shirt or a keychain, right? To kind of move this conversation forward, or the conversation that they want us to have forward. But to me, the possibility is freedom, right? Freedom for the students that we serve to be who they are, right? Like, why, if we believe that higher education is the place to, build civically engaged or, thoughtful multicultural citizens, then that can happen in this space when we expand our understandings of gender. But if we're not really interested in that, and I'll be honest, I don't think we're interested in it. Like, I think some of us are, and are actively trying to, this reminds me of a conversation I had with Z, like, not just write about it, but actually do it, to live it in our everyday. But a part of me feels like people are just not interested, because it's like, okay, well, what do I do with myself, right? If I'm so heavily invested in who I am as a woman and my understanding of femininity, but there's something that I feel is challenging that, then what am I supposed to do? So that was, sorry, not to be another cloud, but here I am.
You're good. We got 2 clouds and no possibilities for you, Alex. And so that's what you're going to get to on that question. So we are running out of time, and this conversation has been so stimulating for me personally, and my senses for others too, based on the chat box. And so I would love each of you just to take a brief moment as a final closing out question. If you could say like a takeaway or something that you just want to leave the audience with from today's conversation, what would that be? And so let's start with you, TJ, and we'll just go around.
I think for me, to think and act more expansively, one has to do that with their own gender first. That was very true for myself, right? All of these concepts were very theoretical and intellectual until transness gifted me with needing to check my own gender and figure that stuff out, right? It allowed me to accept masculinity and manhood for myself, but it also, at an institutional level, allowed me to make sense of how, say, a Title IX in higher education process is set up to protect the institution and as a form of administrative violence per Dean Spade, and allows for victim of relationship and sexual violence to be disposed of and branded as perpetrators. But that's a webinar for another day.
Thank you, TJ, for that. Layla.
Succinctly, I would say that we just need to ask different questions and consider how the frameworks we choose to use, whether it's something singularly or multi-level, how we're situating those questions. If we're going to use intersectionality, that we actually read Kimberly Crenshaw's work and consider the argument that she's making, and that we're not simplifying really complex issues.
Thank you, Layla. Keon, what are your final thoughts?
So in agreement with everything that TJ and Layla have said, I would add, grounding our work in some community that we're responsible to and accountable to. I think a lot of the work that I do alongside Black and brown cisgender men, we have also begun to create structured, incentivized, right, paid work for folks who serve as kind of advisory to the work that we do without it being exploitative. But my homie Nicholas Brady often says that closed doors is where patriarchy goes to hide. And so as much as the good intentions that we might have, we must be accountable to folks. And lastly, it's just to, I would say, using Cynthia Dillard's word of cutting the heel, not to bleed. I think knowing that it requires a reckoning, but that this reckoning is aimed towards healing, right? In this type of work. So I'll say that.
Great. And Z.
Yeah, I love that call to accountability and community, Keon. I also think I'm learning quite a bit from Black studies, and one of the things I'm learning from Black studies scholars is that refusal is important and powerful in and of its own right. We cannot be everything to everyone, and I think especially when faced with logics of killability, when faced with rhetorics around, well, rhetorics and ontological realities of erasure and foreclosure, I think that refusing that is really important and powerful, and can be an act of solidarity with and for the people that we're in relation with and that we want to be in right relation with. And so, yeah, thinking about refusing some of that, thinking about how refusal can be a place of world making with and for our communities can be really powerful.
Great. Well, I wish we had a whole nother hour with you all. I think we could have kept going. This was beautiful, but I really, really appreciate your time, your thoughts, putting the work out there too for folks to consume. So yes, thank you so much, TJ, Layla, Keon, and Z for a really stimulating conversation. For today's fourth and final ASHE Presidential Webinar, and I extend my gratitude as well to President D.L. Stewart for the invitation to moderate these. I've really enjoyed them. So I just want to take a moment just to offer my profuse gratitude to all of the panelists for your vulnerability and wisdom over the past 4 webinars. If you missed any of the webinars, they're available on the ASHE website. I hope you'll go watch them, engage, and learn. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you take care of yourselves and each other.
And if I can jump in real quick, just a tremendous thank you to Stephen John Quaye for leading these on behalf of myself, on behalf of DL, on behalf of the entire ASHE membership. Your brilliance and the passion that you brought into each of these webinars, just thank you, thank you, thank you, Stephen. Thank you. All right, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.